Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Today, we are joined by Jason Bahbak Mohaghegh, author of Night and Night 2 from Zero Books, and also author of Omnicide and the forthcoming Omnicide II from Urbanomic. Omnicide is a project which catalogues an array of manic dispositions and their deathly trajectories. Through an archival lens of Middle Eastern authors and poets, Omnicide also details the multidimensional landscape and the elaborate network of spaces and interstices where mania communicates with fatality. Today on the show, we also have Kyle of Labor Kyle fame, and we have Emo Foucault from the Acid Horizon podcast. Jason, welcome to the show today.
Hello to all of you. Nice to see everyone.
And I want to start out just by apologizing to you. I was supposed to be on the interview for Night 2, but I got COVID during that time, and it was such a disappointment, but I'm glad that you came back with us today.
The plague comes for all of us, and you had your turn then. No worries. There's always an eternal return, so you have a second chance today.
Excellent. So let's just begin. I'm sure that some of our listenership has already either read or encountered Omnicide 1. Could you just give us an overview of the Omnicide project and what it is that you set out to do with the first book, and why did you feel that a second installment was in order?
The project it's an intense look into the question of madness, essentially, but also the question of apocalypse and sort of the end of worlds simultaneously, and trying to link sort of death and desire, madness and apocalypse in those thematics. So that the first and second text differ in their strategic orientation. So the first book is very vertical in one respect, that it's almost like moving through the spiral levels of a tower. There are 10 different stratum to every single mania that's done there, but there are only 15 or so manias that are explored. Things like the obsession with maps, the obsession with whirlpools, the obsession with giants, the obsession with mirrors. But then there were still something around 127 other manias that I had left as unfinished business. And so it was always meant that there was going to be a second book where I would settle the score with this challenge that I had set to myself. But for that, I couldn't do this 10 for 10 method again of every music box having 10 compartments that I would take in these kind of depths. Instead, it had to be more horizontal. So the second book is more the architecture. If the first was the architecture of a tower, this is more the architecture of a labyrinth. It's very horizontal, moving from surface to surface. And each mania, whether it's Basamania, the obsession with deep waters, Aeromania, the obsession with razors, Nephomania, the obsession with clouds, Heliomania, the obsession with laughter. Each one of these, you get just one shot or one chance. And every one of them, one password that hangs there, and then some articulation, which leads also to a potential kind of doomsday prophecy of some kind in its philosophy. So shows the twist of how this instant of ecstasy or of rapture or of delirium could also reverse or flip into a devastation of a certain kind. So that's the difference in terms of the sort of the scope and the layering of how it was done. But in terms of what motivated, so it's actually an intriguing thing. I'm going to let all of you in on the behind the scenes that probably the last place on earth that you would conceive to write a very dark text in certain ways is the Mediterranean, where I wrote it. So I was in southern Spain for 3 years writing this along the coasts of the waters in one of the most beautiful landscapes that you could ever imagine. It's strange to write an apocalyptic work in a utopia, of a certain kind. But except that then I discovered something. And it's actually in the introduction, the introduction is called the Book of the 11th Hour. And it's where I start to articulate certain doomsday images that I picked up down there. So these were actual phenomena that I encountered. So the first one was, the first section of the introduction is called Raised by Wolves. And the reason is that while I was wandering through these ranges of mountains, jagged limestone formations in southern Spain, I actually came across Eurasian and tundra wolves, which are near extinction. And there's no way to save them from extinction. The Spanish have tried, and there's only about 8 of them left in existence at this point. And I locked eyes with one of them. There's nothing magical or supernatural to that, but I locked eyes with one that was on a nearby cliff and sort of stared at it. And it was, the sight of this doomed creature, that was probably just scavenging or preying or even just resting in idleness across this adjacent rock cliff. It was a mesmerizing sight. And it started sort of in those chasms, I started to think more about what it means to be a doomed entity, what it means to be the last of your kind. And the tranquility of that place was really terrifying in a way. But also it was a beautiful challenge to try to rise to. So to try and honor those wolves was one of the things in Spain that I found that did that, and the unflinching gaze that it had. And unflinching beings are always have an awful advantage. They don't break eye contact. So the second thing that I found was I discovered an old solarium in Cordoba, Spain, that was run by a famous astronomer of the medieval era. His name was Maslama al-Majriti. He's also claimed to, but this is probably inaccurate, to be the figure who wrote a book of spells and talismans called the Picatrix in Latin, but it was the Ghayat al-Hakim, aim of the sage. It's probably wrongly attributed to him, but what is correct is that he was a palace astronomer, but he and his daughter formed a secret society. And in that secret, in around the 10th century, and he founded the secret society in that solarium, a school of astronomy and mathematics. That was its facade. But it was devoted to, all day long, just perfecting the observation of eclipses, writing calendrical tables, figuring out how to make the moon more visible, lunar visibility, things like of that nature. But the daughter, whose name was Fatima of Madrid, also ran this secret society there that tried to see if there were any hints in these astronomical celestial orbits that would tell them something about the end of the world. And so I got to stand in the ruins of that solarium one evening in Spain as well, and think about the strange occultist sanctum, and the spells that they worked on. They were also alchemists, interestingly enough. The third thing, actually, I realized I was in good company. Just to give you another example of something that motivated this text. I'm not the only writer in history who wrote a very dark work in this very elegant and stunning place. So there are 4 other authors who wrote their darkest material in southern Spain. One is Lord Byron, sort of the romantic poet. He wrote his most sort of desolate, solitary, tormented work, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, while he was wandering across southern Spain through Andalusia. A lot of people don't know that the great Hans Christian Andersen, the writer of fairy tales, very eerie fairy tales about street children and frozen orphan girls and deformed birds, shipwrecked princes, mutilated child dancers. These are all imagery that he actually devises in southern Spain while he's loitering at nightfall among Muslim ruins and the street children and so-called gypsy performers, now Roma as they're called. And they populate his later stories. But again, he was a wanderer of southern Spain as well. But his settings are always these disturbing northern European forests or winter kind of alleyways. But nevertheless, they're actually authored. His inspiration comes from there. There's Hemingway, of course, very famously obsessed with the bullfights of Spain and also the running of the bulls in Pamplona. And we all know how he ended. He tried to walk into an airplane propeller, tried to throw himself from a flying plane. He underwent electroshock therapy of horrific kinds. And so it's strange that he was this very mangled and ravaged figure who nevertheless was sort of trying to unravel the existential struggle of the human in Spain again, in these very sort of wonderful places. And the last one is the Austrian poet Rilke. Who a lot of people don't. He got writer's block right at the end of his life when he was dying of cancer. He couldn't finish his Duino elegies, which is his greatest poetic achievement. So he moved to a hotel, and I've stayed in that hotel in Ronda. Ronda, Spain, is overseeing these massive chasms, these huge ravines. It's an ancient town. It was perched upon a cliff so that it couldn't be invaded ever. And he just used to stare out at night at these at these chasm spaces. And he wrote his Duino elegies, where he says things like, "Every angel is terrifying," and so just amazing work that comes there. And he later dies very soon after of hemophilia. The high school in that town is named after him, by the way. So I noticed that the darkest imaginations of these four figures, like myself, was somehow unlocked by a place where the sun doesn't go down until 11 at night, or the ocean. So it's an interesting paradox. What kind of twisted euphoria or vulnerability comes out of that? But those were four of the sort of the four things that created that. And actually, there were four terms that I was working with as well early on, four expressions, and that's just it. We, in every language almost, we have the expression "gone too far." Intrigued by the riddle of the one who goes too far. We have the expression "point of no return." I'm interested in how one defines the threshold of the point of no return. We have the expression "as good as dead." I'm intrigued by the puzzle of that. And finally, the term "the lost cause." So gone too far, point of no return, good as dead, and lost cause. Those are also the four ciphers or codes that are behind the scaffolding of the first chapter, which opens Omnicide II.
It's almost as if there's a connection, almost like an archetypal sort of calling for the author to detach oneself or dispossess themselves of familiarity, to go off to a foreign land and to write the kind of book that you wrote, almost as if to sit on the fringe or sit with the limit, as it were. Clearly, something happened to you at the end of writing Omnicide I, where you felt that you had to continue the project. And what's interesting, at least about the introduction to Omnicide II as compared to Omnicide I, is it's not merely omnicide, as if there's merely omnicide, but we're talking firmly about a philosophy of doom. So what was it about perhaps the exit or the departure from the initial phase of the project that then turned into this focus on this notion of doom as the object of the philosopher for you?
It's a great question. I'm sort of like Alice in Wonderland in that, if I catch an intimation of a white rabbit passing by, I kind of can't say no. And so there's these sort of irresistible phenomena. And so just certain things started, again, in my travels, I started taking notes of certain things. So one of them, and it's actually I forgot to say it, the fourth part of the introduction, is that I also and it answers your question directly of why doom. I strayed by three sites in Italy where the Roman Empire used to throw people from heights, and it was one of the modes of execution. There's a million: beheading, starvation. You can drown people, you can suffocate them, you can burn them to death. There's a whole awful array of things that humanity has invented to mutilate itself. But this one of throwing people from towers or throwing them from rock cliffs. So the Tarpeian Rock is a famous one in Rome. The Gemonian Stairs is another one where emperors would delight in strangling and then throwing the bodies down staircases, long winding staircase. And then there's the Isle of Capri. And the Isle of Capri was where the Emperor Tiberius delighted in just watching enemies flung from the precipices into the sea coves below. And if they survived, they would bash them with the oars of waiting boatmen to make sure that they drown. I saw these sites, and you try to enter. I don't say there's no sadistic delight in going to these places. There's no immediate attraction. You try to wonder what the last thoughts of individuals are, where they led up those cliffs. I don't take it lightly, and I don't take it again with some sort of sickly pleasure principle. Again, for those who know, some of my early works are devoted to prison poets who were tortured, and I have members of my own family who have been political prisoners who were tortured and who still bear the scars quite visibly on them. And so it's not about an ode to human cruelty. I tend not to like rulers or emperors and all that, but it was more about trying to enter the thoughts and the mode of consciousness of the one being led on that long walk to the top of those heights, and the type of doomed imagination that must surface. What do you think about? What do you dream about? What memories come to mind? What are the last thoughts? That's almost unbearable to try and fathom, but it's something that I think that I don't use the term ethically, but I have a certain code, let's say a certain sense of honor, very old world sense of honor that compels me to try and do justice to thinking those questions through. So that would be a thing. But then there were points of fascination. So quick to answer your question of again why this move to doom, I started researching two simultaneous histories: the history of hypnotism and the history of anesthesia. And they make a quick appearance in the text, just as a side note. But just was fascinated by these the dream temples of the ancient Babylonians and Egyptians. And they actually realized you could do things, sonic induction, using sound. So the playing of a single musical note, or the sound of susurration, like a shh sound, or chanting, or the sound of water, things that are used today in like spa culture,
right,
to create radical calmness and all that. But they didn't have often sort of the medical knowledge of anesthesia yet. And so they had to cultivate all these tricks. Sometimes touch. They used ice, silk, pillows, trying to experiment with softness or with smoothness. They used elixirs and vegetal concoctions, which were fatal in many cases. So they tried deadly nightshade. I mean, it's in the name. Belladonna, deadly nightshade. Black henbane, mandrake. Each had their own unique alkaloid mixtures: atropines, scopolamine, ioscyamine. These are the pharmaceuticals behind it. But again, this is not the distilled version that you get in a pharmaceuticals lab. This is the Pandora's box version that can cause hell in terms of side effects on individuals. And so hallucinatory effects, sort of strange rapid heart rates and all that. So, but these were things that I was interested in, how the anesthetist, and my wife is an anesthetist actually. And so, and was a pediatric anesthetist, which means she put children to sleep in particular. And so that's kind of a figure of doom in a symbolic way, one who lulls you into the unconscious or into the dark. So that was a certain lineage that I was looking at. I also became intrigued. I've always been intrigued by dark monks. So there are figures, the very known ones like Rasputin and Nostradamus, who were able to. But this is what always fascinated me about those stories, which makes no sense in the theological history, because both Rasputin and Nostradamus, whether it's in the Catholic or the East Orthodox Church's version, are dark magicians. But the question they can't ask is, how are they able to acquire prophetic sacred powers without being chosen prophets? So how do they tap into this reservoir of magical ability, supposedly, if God has not blessed them or anointed them to have these miraculous powers? And they can't answer that. So there's some occultic back channel that they were supposedly able to steal access to these highly exclusive domains of sort of divine power. Interestingly, Saint Francis of Assisi, now he's one of the ones that got sort of canonized, but a strange figure, said to receive the stigmata, the spontaneous manifestation of the wounds of Christ on his body. But all three of them, I started researching them. All three of them have a few things in common. One, they were prone to cataclysmic visions. All of them had visions of floods, earthquakes, famines, conflagrations. They also were all legendary healers. So Nostradamus was known to forge good luck charms. He was also invited by the king of his time to help combat plague. Rasputin allegedly cured the Tsar's son of hemophilia. And St. Francis of Assisi, he pacified ferocious wolves in one legend. And he was also the patron saint against dying by fire and dying alone. So strange figures who, without any metaphysical permission, were able to pull off metaphysical sort of tasks. So the hypnotist, the anesthetist, the dark monks, they were all in the sort of the background of my mind there. Anyway, I'll leave it. There are others like blade makers of Damascene steel. That's a big one for me. I'm studying that, going and seeing in Syria where these old guilds would forge these weapons that Damascene steel, if you don't know, they have patterns that resemble waves or rippling water or teardrops, said to be the most the most brilliant, most masterful, shatter-resistant edges. You can cut through silken scarves or strands of hair simply by touching them with the steel, supposedly. But they've never been able to demonstrate how, or they were never able to replicate the method until just last year. Do you know that for thousands of years they've been trying to figure out the secret of Damascene steel, and they realized that it has nothing to do with the methodology exactly, the hammering methods and thermal cycling processes of the guilds. It had everything to do, or even there were all these legends that they would plunge these red hot blades in the blood of slaves, or in the or into the stomach of a slave in order to temper it. All these rumors, because they couldn't figure out the methodology. But it turns out that it actually it comes down to the secret component, which is a trace impurity of an element named vanadium that just happens to be in the metal formations around Syria. So it's a 0.3% concentration that exists in Damascene sabers, and that's it. It's a simple impurity that actually created the greatest metal that has ever existed. And I like that paradox as well. And that was something that I thought of mania in that regard. How mania is often seen as a kind of fleeting impurity, a fascination with one object above all others, but it can unlock the greatest forms of creativity or possibility. So anyway.
I think one question that Kyle and I kind of share, and maybe I'll let Kyle ask his own version of it, but the sort of incredible, archive that you create seems to me to require, and this reflects a question that I sent to you about philosophical temperament. I mean, you're this font of conceptual figures. I mean, certainly at this point, the listeners who are listening, clearly understand that you have a breadth of knowledge on various topics. But my question is, how do you contain or manage the resources required to create this kind of archive of mania? And what do you think is maybe the affective ecology of the archivist of mania? Do you yourself see yourself as having a kind of mania for the archive?
Definitely, but I see my function in this in three ways, and I say this with the humility of someone who I appreciate the compliment of saying that there's this immense sort of colossal scope of examples and sources and all of that, which there are. But if I allow myself to get sort of too engaged or there has to be some sort of method that I play by as well, some rules sort of my own process. And so I actually, to some extent, I'll say this, to some extent, I perceive Omnicide II as my last book. That doesn't mean it will be my last book by any stretch of the imagination. And I have certain friends in my inner circles who laugh every time I say that, because I've said that before. But I feel it's the last book in terms of everything beyond this point is a luxury. It fulfills sort of the occasion of what I wanted to do in terms of a certain signature, a certain imprint, a certain trick up my sleeve that I wanted to demonstrate. But then there's a temptation always, and the temptation is what you find in Kafka's diaries. Do you let the reader in on all of the complexities of the moves that you're making, so that they can, not for admiration's sake, but just so that they can appreciate the game, they can appreciate the tactical levels of this that they might miss otherwise? And so, I mean, you read something like, not necessarily my favorite poet, but T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. You know that the book of references that explain all his allusions is bigger than the poem itself. And and the question is always, when you have a compendium like that, does it ruin sort of the enchantment, or is it a necessary thing or a helpful thing? So when I read Kafka's diaries, for instance, Kafka's diaries are looking glasses into the Kafka, into how he constructs the Kafkaesque. He takes you sort of into the theater of operation of his own methodology as a storyteller. And I came to the decision, I always, again, was sort of disturbed by whether or not that's a good move or not, to show all those sort of, magicians aren't supposed to show their, the sort of the rhyme and reason of their spectacle. But then I decided to do it for this. So there are 3 other interlude books in these sort of this array of manias. And actually, that's where I'm explaining a method of myself as an author to some extent doing this. The first one is called, the first one I already talked about is kind of the Book of the 11th Hours. The first is the introduction, but then there are three others. One is the Book of the Opium Den. And opium literature is something that's an undercurrent in the history of Middle Eastern literature. The Opium Den is a very sort of strange and mercurial, nebulous site that haunts the sort of the cultural imagery. But there, I didn't want to get sort of to exoticize the Opium Den sort of in an Orientalist fashion. What I was interested in is that I was able to isolate 8 principles of what has to happen in the Opium Den. So I have 8 principles. Principle 1, vanishing, becoming subtle, parentheses, becoming subtle. Principle 2, immolation, becoming merciless. 3, solitude, becoming innocent. 4, secrecy, becoming hidden. 5, horror, becoming caged. 6, distillation, becoming sunken. 7, beastliness, becoming massacred. And 8, ephemerality, becoming dream. These 8 concepts, I think, are at the essence of a lot of my method. How to be subtle, merciless, innocent, hidden, how to create cages, how to sink and create sunkenness. Again, I'm not the partaker of the Opium Den, I'm the host of the Opium Den. And so I have to create the atmosphere for this and ultimately becoming dream. But then that's just one sort of insight into how I see my own role. The second is a game master of a certain kind. And so there's a section called the Book of Poor Games. And I describe how there's differentiations. There are games of endurance. There are games where you're supposed to cheat. There are games of unclear progress where you don't know if you're doing well until it's too late. There are games of self-endangerment where you have to risk yourself in order to win. There are games of sudden shifts, of wild betting, of changing rules, levels, or roles, games of narrow victory, games of distraction, games of clues and signs, games with dealers, games of territoriality. There are addictive games. There are infinite games that go on forever. There are games where you have to enter the opponent's mind. And so one of the questions I honestly ask myself this every time I construct a passage in Omnicide is, what game am I playing? Or rather, what game am I constructing in order for the reader to play? And so providing that manual and that list at the end is a way, an index for people to ask themselves that if they were curious, because that is something that is built into the architecture of everyone. And the last thing I would just say, the final chapter in the whole book, the epilogue, is called the Book of the Liar. And I do see myself as a deceptive figure. And I stand by that, not in an immoral sense of deception as some form of domination. But I think that the greatest thinkers, authors, artists in the world, they manipulate us. They distort us. They trade in riddles and rumors and intimacy. You know, to be a great liar, you have to master intimacy. It's what con man means. It means to gain confidence. It's short for confidence. How do you get someone to confide in you when you're a total stranger? So how do you now again, you can use that to destructive, exploitative, coercive ends, but that's not what we're doing here. I'm giving gifts, hopefully. I didn't, I'm not asking anyone for anything. I'm just trying to create a banquet or a masquerade, for people to enjoy. But for that, I do have to manipulate their vulnerability. I do have to learn the art of persuasion. There has to be a certain cunning, seduction as a concept. How do you create awe? How do you induce metamorphosis? And ultimately, even there are moments when the author has to betray the reader or has to disappear. I swear there are moments in my favorite writers' works where they leave, where they abandon you. Kafka especially. There are moments when he abandons you in the forest and he says, "Why did you ever trust me to come out here?" And starts to vanish from the text. All of these are just different rungs of the ladder that I had to kind of learn and try and instill. So the liar, the game master, and the opium den host are kind of three imageries or three masks that I think that I have to do well if I'm going to pull it off.
Great. Well, I want to make room for questions and comments from the others. Will, go ahead.
Yeah, there's something really interesting about the way that this text manifests, again, not necessarily as like an ethics, but there certainly is a component about a particular ethos And a lot of the I wanted to ask a question about folly and madness, right, and its relation to the history of maritime existence, like the Narrenchef, right, or the ship of fools.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting is the way in which a lot of the discussion about these figures is almost a processual sort of canonic relation to the self. Like when you're talking about the immolation and the annihilation of the soul, I see a relation to the history of mysticism that's as expansive as contemporary as Simone Weil, but all the way back to like Beatrice of Nazareth or Marguerite Perret. Or there's a kind of relation between sort of doom and abandonment. And you talk about trust as an item that's toyed with by Kafka, right? Kafka will lead you out into this literary abyss and say, why did you think I would ever take you anywhere else? But in a certain sense, there's also this necessity to play that own game with yourself. And I'm wondering, when you talk about, because you're using very classical, what I really appreciate is the almost classical approach to the question of madness. The question of hyper obsessive mania. It's almost straight out of almost a Cartesian classical notion of folly. And I'm wondering, how much of this can be related to a kind of conduct of not just a leading of someone else, but a sort of conduct of the self in this question of doom and end. Because I think that seems to be one of the more quiet strains in this project of yours that I'm really interested in.
Oh, there's a lot there. Thank you so much for that. Let me answer that again with a reference to certain things. So first, you brought up Foucault's wondrous, Madness and Civilization, the Ship of Fools, which is, that in the ancient world, far less brutal, not to say that it's not cruel at some levels, but far less brutal than our modern treatment of the mad figure who is incarcerated, regulated, placed under surveillance, subjected to perpetual judgment at the hands of figures of purity who walk around in white robes, sort of the new priesthood of the medical establishment. And we know the dark histories of the insane asylums. Foucault does a wonderful job in exposing that, and we've lost too many geniuses to a lot of their torture mechanisms, and I spend a lot of time with figures like Antonin Artaud and others, and, who were just absolutely decimated by electroshock therapy and by a lot of the lobotomies and things of that nature that we know about. So the ancients, they chose exile as the punishment for if a mad figure became slightly too agitated to contain them as the so-called village idiot anymore. Who we picture typically as a happy-go-lucky sort of subject, sort of roaming the hills, singing to themselves. But if they did become predisposed to violence or to disruption, they were put on the ship of fools. But I would note that inasmuch as there was that destiny for the insane in the ancient world, they also were at the top of power structures. So if you take someone like Caligula, I swear like 80% of the emperors of Rome were mad. From Nero to Caligula to Heliogabalus. But if you look at Caligula, it's something that I picked up, and this answers to Craig too as an archivist. Something like this you wouldn't think would make its way into a serious philosophical work, if that's what you want to call it. That I just came upon an auction that was happening in Europe 2 years ago for Caligula's ring. And it's a sapphire ring, a beautiful sapphire ring. And I'm just with this light purple hololith, it's called, with an engraved profile of a woman that was believed to be his fourth wife, Caesonia, who presented her own neck willingly for death after her husband was killed, by the way. Now, this was held in private collections by dukes and princes and all that for centuries, and now it's on auction for over $1 million. This ring of Caligula, and I was curious as to one, how does someone so clearly manic at some levels. I mean, for those who don't know, Caligula dressed as a god and declared himself a living solar divinity. He often spoke to the moon. He walked on gold coins. He drank precious pearls that were melted in vinegar because he believed that that's the diet of gods, to drink melted pearls. He appointed his horse a high priest of the empire. He wasted the entire fortune of Rome on a useless floating bridge. He committed incest with all three of his sisters. He was terrified of lightning. These are things that we know about Caligula. Among the fact that he also inspired the later ruler Nero to hang people as human lanterns on fire at times for entertainment. What does someone want to buy this ring for? I'm very curious as to what kind of collector's item this becomes. Do they think that some type of strange power will be transfused from the ancient mad emperor into themselves if they walk around wearing Caligula's ring? So there is even a question about how madness circulates. That's almost a ship of fools in the sense that madness was sent to distant shores. And now we have this ring returning in history to be collected by some elite, some aristocrat who's hoping that there may be some type of sympathetic magic or transfusional power of the, of the madness or godliness of this figure. But at the same time that you have the mad figures at the center of power, and the same time that you have them in exile, you also have figures, since you asked about sort of the ancient here, I would just note, you mentioned a few. I would mention also Simeon the Stylite, who was a mystic who went on top of a massive, platform for, I think, 37 years, lived at the top of this platform. People would bring him food by ladders, and he refused to come down in order for him to be closer to the gods. This is an interesting figure, and it created all this copycat phenomenon in the ancient world of other stylites who would sit on platforms for decades at a time and withdraw from the world. Also, another figure, and he's quoted at the outset, it's the only non-Middle Eastern figure who's really quoted, is Empedocles, who believed that the universe was, and this is an interesting thing, was made of wrath. That was the term he used. Wrath was the central concept of existence. And for those who don't know, Empedocles threw himself into a volcano, believing that it would transform him into a god. We're still waiting to see whether or not that happened. But interesting, just last point to that, when you said sort of what's the, or you asked about the ethics or the orientation, one other thing that I studied, again, I'm just giving examples to try and clarify in a fragmented sort of way, different ways of sort of insights or ways of approaching this. I'm sure some of you know about Tengurism. Tengurism is a Mongolian and Siberian, you can call it religion. It's a long persecuted animist sort of belief system of the horse riding tribes of Mongolia and all that. And they've divided their priesthood into white shamans and black shamans. Now the white shamans, they serve the 55 beneficent Tingri, the highest divinity class of the pantheon. And the white shamans do blessings, they commune with nature, they're healers, exorcists, midwives, bone setters. That's really important among horse riding tribes, nomadic tribes, being able to settle bones. And they're typically women in the tribe that are draped in feathers, capes, they carry silk fans, bells, wood staffs, and they supervise the overall health of the clan. They're also necessary for fertility and curing infertility. They look over the bodies, and they supposedly derive their powers from the west, the white heaven, and they're aligned with mountain foxes, snakes, reindeers, wolves, owls, or ravens. Now, what's more interesting to me, or just as interesting to me, are the shamans of the black. Now, the shamans of the black, they form a priestly class that's thought to possess a direct alignment with the 44 Tingri, who are the terrible ones, controllers of the black side of the universe or the black heaven. They're the most fearsome sorcerers in the shamanic tradition. They burn wild plants, they carry ritual drums. They're often clad in dark robes and animal hides or antlers and horned headdresses, and they derive their powers from the accursed energies of the north. Now, what's interesting here is that they become instrumental. They don't live with the tribes. They live in these Neolithic and Paleolithic caves up in the mountains of Mongolia, away from the tribes. They're only called down in really one of two, sometimes for hunting expeditions, but mostly for war, because they curse enemies. They can bring scourge to livestock or harvests of the other enemies. They are always accompanying chieftains to battle. Genghis Khan used to have 100 shamans of the black with him everywhere that he went in war. And that's why there's a great line by Genghis Khan, and not that I'm a huge fan of him, this marauding destroyer of cities, but he used to always proclaim, "I am the punishment of the universe," before he entered a city and raided it. And that line was given to him as a spell of the shamans of the black. Now, why do I think that? And one other thing about them. You have to be careful summoning a shaman of the black, because they're allowed to demand any payment whatsoever for their task that they do for the tribe, including the right to demand a child as a disciple that they take back with them to the mountains. So, and you don't mess with a shaman, you can't say no to a shaman of the black, or they'll unleash God knows what, supposedly. Now, I'm interested, again, it's not a question of whether I believe in these things. I mean, psychosomatic, I don't believe in my own name. I don't believe in society either. So we're all just operating in delusions constantly. But these are more interesting ones than everyday society, at the very least. That's my criterion. They're aesthetically superior. They're philosophically superior than what I hear in the train every day. And so that's why I follow them. Not because I believe in them, but also because I know that it doesn't really matter whether or not the shamans of the black really do convene with the black energies of the universe. It's that entire peoples believe that they do. That's important. That means something. So what I was going to say, though, is that why then would I want to sort of become a shaman of the black for the purposes of this book? Remember, they're only instrumental in times of war. And I do believe in something that William Burroughs said, not everything he said, God knows, but he did say one quote that always stuck with me. He said, "This is a war universe." I think that we're in a war universe. And so one needs to know how to do what they do. So that's an ethical thing for me as well. There's a certain ethics involved. So that's an answer then, I hope, somewhat of a strange answer to you.
Great. There's an incredible rain on my dome right now, so if it's infecting my mic, I apologize. Kyle, I want to pass it to you. Go ahead and feel free to ask Jason a question.
Sure, yeah. I'm particularly interested, as we discussed before, Jason, in the way that you give language to an exploration of certain limits. We've been talking about it over the conversation in some really interesting ways. We talked about it from the idea of the Tarpeian rock and the sort of the destructive production of falling from a great height, while also considering transfusional new limits in historical objects, as you're talking about with Caligula's ring, find very interesting, but ultimately coming down to limits as a plane of human experience, and that be it through social interpretation, but also through sort of our other digressions in the past, at least in antiquity, as you use as examples, digression into unfamiliar phenomena as productive phenomena. All of a sudden, everything is given its due in this sort of expanse from the top of the tower all the way to the bottom of the ocean, these various different spaces in between. You talk in the first volume of Omnicide about, in the introduction, about the middle degree of affect in all too human subjectivity, which is this idea that in contrast to the pursuits of Omnicide, these pursuits of limits and whatever creatively is to be gained from these limits, otherwise is to sink into a social discursive panic, so to speak. We talked first of all about the archive as sort of a prescriptive fiction, as an apparatus, and alternatively, you propose a explicitly cryptic terrain rather than a familiar hierarchy of consideration. And again, if we're borrowing from Foucault, this is a consideration of the narrativized truth content of an archival formation or of archaeological sciences, archives as affirming compartments for discursive formation, but in the exploration of limits as a sort of a macro imposition on your text, as a logging of negative phenomena, and again, in an archival sense. Do you see this particular way of exploring limits through mania as, in this archival sense, as maybe provoking entrance into what you described again in the first volume of Omnicide as manic straits? Basically, if we accept thinking through in delirium as a central affirming component of collapse in the exploration of limits and the limits of the own language of limits or whatever, as this over speculative onus, I'm just curious as to how the how of this alternative formation in thought and its relationship to, you know, the exploration of limits in an archival sense, if that makes sense. I apologize.
Thanks. If the three of you would like to, please do any book talks for me in the future. I think you can do it better than myself. You can articulate the complications of this work just so eloquently. Thank you. I'm taking notes on what you're saying my work does. Thank you so much for that. It's a great gift. But by the way, if any of you want to get me Caligula's ring as an honorarium, I wouldn't say no to that. I'd appreciate.
So you do want it.
That's right. Just to stop anyone evil from getting the ring's powers. No, let me take this in two parts, Ian Khan. Let me jump to examples that help demonstrate, because you asked a series of, but really I want to distill it into two things. First, the unfamiliar objects. The function is to defamiliarize all objects by tracing kind of their fragmentary histories, to show that there's no unifying history. And you can do this in the most material sense with something like, there's a passage in there that I've written in Omnicide II on the history of blindfolds, right? So if you take blindfolds, for instance, you can find 4 different types of figures who appropriate blindfolds willfully. One are martial artists who practice with blindfolds in order to demonstrate offensive and defensive forms, grappling, holding, push hand styles and techniques. Great kung fu masters were known to blindfold themselves while practicing forms. Second, though, go to a completely other end of a spectrum, executed rebels who were given the choice whether or not to wear a blindfold, where only the eyes are covered, which is the exact opposite paradigm of the executioner, the hooded executioner, who only their eyes are visible. Interestingly, you would think there that it's kind of a garment of cowardice, but actually the blindfold in certain traditions of executed rebels and martyrs actually signals great courage before the firing squad or the axe. And so that's another destiny of that object. Third is, I'm teaching a seminar right now about this obscure avant-garde movement of 4 French youth who were called Le Grand Jeu, the Great Game. They were kind of underdog competitors against surrealism. They wrote most of their stuff between ages of 16 and 20. They ingested poisonous leaves and strychnine and did strange things. But one of the things they did was they would blindfold themselves and bicycle through their town at night. And God knows if they ran into walls and all of that stuff. But it was to attempt to develop some type of paroptic vision, which is to see visual phenomena without the use of your eyes, right? But also to navigate. So now we've got Kung Fu martial artists, Kung Fu masters, executed rebels, avant-garde writers. And then fourth, to go even more ancient than all those, because Kung Fu is more medieval to some extent, even, think about those Oedipal kings and monks and seers who blinded, or more seers and kings and figures who blinded themselves and then walked around with blindfolds. So Oedipus being one of them, who... It's what's fascinating about the Oedipal myth. Everybody forgets that after Oedipus the king, there's Oedipus at Colonus, and they don't really go there because the masterpiece is the first one. But after he pierces his own eye sockets and blinds himself, he wanders. He becomes this kind of itinerant, wandering beggar figure who goes from city to city. And in a fascinating sense, his ability, he gains a superpower from his sacrificial gesture, from his agony, which is that he can curse or bless cities depending on how they treat him. Interestingly enough, it is the exact same thing that Cain is said to derive from the mark of Cain. That when he tells God that people will hate me and will try to kill me, basically God, there's a Talmudic interpretation that God tells him that whoever, it's almost mafia-esque, whoever touches you, even though I've cursed you, no one has the right to curse you other than me. So any city you walk into, if they treat you ill, ill will fall upon them. And so they become cursors or blessers of cities, depending on it. So there you have, again, 4 figures, sort of typologies that reorient the blindfold, just a material object. And so you don't have one governing centralized history of even this small piece of cloth. It means different things to a martial artist or to an avant-garde, modernist, or to an executed rebel, revolutionary, or whatever. But so that's the first thing. Now, the second question you asked about the point you made about the archive and what the function of the archive is here. Something that I was always interested in, because it comes from my Iranian heritage, are halls of mirrors, mirror halls. And it's interesting, everybody celebrates the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles as the preeminent example. It's actually very relatively simple flat mirror design that's going on there. When you take the Persian practice of Ayn-e-Kari, which means mirror making, which was done by mystics, mystical craftspeople in the medieval era, they gave rise to far more elaborate interior assemblages throughout, even royal palaces, shrines, tea houses, mausoleums. Actually, perhaps the greatest one in existence was just attacked, most likely by the regime itself, the Islamic regime itself, as a kind of staged attempt to claim terrorism. It's a whole convoluted politics that's happening right now there with a lot of revolutionary unrest. But Shah Cheragh, the King of Light Mausoleum, which is a shrine that has a single tomb in it. Oh my God, the geometrical figures that you see there of all these, it casts this ominous green light through it. You can Google it if you want to and see it. That are just formed from this terrain of optical wonderment of these small, needles and pens that they use to cut these glass shards. And it emanates from actually a statement by a great medieval Sufi mystic who said that the only way to ever glimpse God would be through a shard of a broken glass mirror. So what's interesting to me there, though, in this Hall of Mirrors, is that if you were to ask the further question of Sufi mystics, is it always the same shard of broken glass? They would say absolutely not. Every time you enter the mausoleum, and again, these are walls that are just covered in crushed glass, you'll find God hiding or concealing himself in a different shard of glass of the mirror. And so I take that elegant architectonics of mirror making, crushed mirror making, shattered mirror making, and I try to use that sort of as a methodology myself. By the way, just another thing, because I have my other side too, which is in the United States, and there these cheap carnivals that occupy the peripheries of small towns, throughout America, and now they're dying out. But sort of in the 80s, when I was growing up, you could find them. They'd come once a year. They were always kind of strange roaming communities. They always had mirror mazes, and that's kind of the decadent, rundown version of the Hall of Mirrors, right? These mirror mazes where you're in these ever tightening steps. You're stumbling against these convex or concave curved panes of glass, trying to figure your way out in these weird fun houses, that they've created. And I see this then as a kind of a fun house mirror or Hall of Mirrors as well. So for that, I've got to follow that fractal methodology, that prismatic methodology, and you're always chasing to try and find your way out. Oftentimes, you just find yourself down another corridor of that. So that's the way I try and use phenomena and objects and references and even literature and even and philosophy in a way.
I'll combine what I think are 2 pressing questions that I had about the text and about you. Maybe you can address the question about the fear of light and darkness, but I want to sort of unpack a little bit some of the descriptions of the ogomania from Omnicide I, and maybe the way it sort of intersects with Selemaniac, the mania of flashing lights from Omnicide II. And I want to go back in the conversation to something that we said about this. I don't even acknowledge my own name, nor do I acknowledge living in this society, but that we live in this sort of soup of relational fantasies, these deliriums. And one of the things that I've kind of worked on a bit is the work of James Hillman, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with. He's an archetypal psychologist. He's a post-Jungian. And some of the themes that you touch on, I think, work very nicely with some of the work that he's done. And I wanted to talk about the relationship between paganism and monotheism a little bit, as it appears in the introduction of Omnicide II, and particularly this notion of the kind of proto-paganist unreal gods, right? These figures that are discontinuous with our reality, and their utter absurdity, this assemblage of body parts, animal parts, and so forth. And I want to contrast that with something that we see in Omnicide I, which is this figure of Lucifer as the light bringer, the one who reveals the alleged farce of monotheism as a mask or suit of many gods, or where in the place of the one god, there's instead this kind of fractured coterie conspiring to extract pleasure in the suffering of the earthbound souls. And the interesting thing about Hillman's work is that he pegs the shift to monotheism in the Western tradition as that which firmly captures us in this sort of imagination of universality, of rationality. There's a sort of way in which the unreal and the real get glued to each other in our projection of the human figure onto the gods. And I was curious, to what extent do you see the idea of either a return to a kind of pantheism or paganism, either in the imaginal sense, and I'm thinking here in the sort of imaginal sense, like what would it be like to have another brush or an encounter of the Western mind, for example, with this sort of like pantheistic orientation? And if we need something like the unreal gods of the proto-paganists to act as a sort of spark or an inception to engender the kind of delirium that will allow us to survive the oncoming apocalypse or doom that we face. Is there something that has been elided from the Western experience through its drunkenness on monotheism, or maybe a kind of sobriety rather, however we want to think it? Not saying that we necessarily need to return, but does this image that you provide in the form of Lucifer announcing to us, hey, this image of the monotheist is an illusion, that it contains within it these multiple figures of this fractured coterie of gods? Is there a way in which we need to make contact with the unreal, as it were?
Well, as testament to the fact that I try to walk the walk, not just talk the talk, I have one child. She's only 6 months old, a newborn daughter. Her name is Eve. Or Eva. And she was born in Spain, so we made it the Spanish version of it. But Eve is the first figure who sort of first figure of doom in a way. She orchestrates the fall. She rebels against the law of the garden and the tyranny of by eating the tree of knowledge. So she's also a figure who wants to know about the catastrophic underside of the universe, or wants to know that what Nietzsche said once. He said, "I'm not the one who saw the truth. I'm the one who smelled the lie." And I think to some extent she has that suspicion. She's far smarter than her masculine counterpart, who just sort of is ignorantly blissful. She very willfully, her curiosity, her intrigue, but also her insurgent spark against this golden prison of a paradise, is something that again is an attempt to undo the monotheistic sort of. Her curiosity is very pagan in a certain sense, and it brings back mortality and pain. Gods could die in the ancient world, in the pagan tradition, and she wants to restore us to, or awaken us to, that existence where things are in play, that no one is guaranteed. As Nietzsche says, gods too decompose. So I would say this. There are a lot of things to say that. First of all, yes, I do love the gods of the unreal. In some ways, if I had to pick an avatar god for myself in this project, it would be actually the ancient Egyptian god Thoth, who's the lunar god of writing, but also writing, wisdom, magic, and equilibrium. Also the god of the calendar, the arbitrator of conflicts, and he's self-created at the outset of time. I think that's a fascinating detail. Worshipped by scribes, they made ink drop sacrifices to him. That was the ritual. And he's considered the great persuader and counselor. And he's supposed to be, Thoth is always pictured in the Egyptian tradition as writing an ever infinitizing compendium, like Borges would have loved this if he had read, because he writes it in the Book of Sand, a book that just keeps growing and growing, and the pages, no matter when you read one page, 5 more are written. So, but Thoth is always documenting an ever infinitizing compendium of the dead, the names of the dead, and the disputes of the living. So it's interesting. It's the disputes of the living, the chaos, the anarchy, the lapses, the conflict that he documents. But the mythologies about Thoth, this is what is really interesting to me. And I love legends about books, lost books, legendary books, books lost in time, books that have certain powers. So it was said in the ancient Egyptian world that anyone who would find the Book of Thoth, if they could locate it, would become the most invincible sorcerer alive, but would simultaneously damn themselves because of that power. So it's always that great double-edged sword of double dealing and of the double gamble in pagan thought, which doesn't exist in monotheism, where everything is about absolute promises and messianic redemptions, that sort of a nice Hegelian synthesis at the end of time, that everything's going to be wrapped up nicely. This could turn out well, it could turn out badly. And it's as circumstantial and incidental as an undeserving person stumbles upon the Book of Thoth. It has nothing to do with destiny. It has to do with chance, with luck, with strange twists and a philosophy of the turn. But interestingly, for all of that, then, Thoth's name is the Lord. His titles are the Lord of Divine Words, but also Master of the Balance. And the reason he's Master of the Balance is not the way we think of balance, but rather that Thoth is the god of neutrality. He's one of the neutrals. And that's something that I tried to master as best as possible here. And that's the type of God who I think is necessary. The neutral gods, that doesn't mean they're passive. It means that they reign in the aftermaths, in the desolate spaces, in the in-betweens, on the outer borders of things, in the blind spots, the blank spaces. That's where they rule. And I think that's what everything hinges on. As for the return of pagan gods, you don't need me to will that. It's unstoppable. The number one record-breaking movie of all time is Avengers Endgame. Those are all pantheistic pagan sort of superheroes flying around the sky. Paganism is making its way back. Never mind the obsession with vampires and mummies and zombies that are all kind of remnants of teratology, sort of the monstrosity of the pagan world. That's suddenly coming back now. So I would say that. But the interesting thing, just to show you how what you're asking about in terms of the unreal, which is such a crucial concept to me. I adore the concept of the unreal. I think it's our only saving grace. How it can actually become materialized in an interesting way. We just went through a pandemic, obviously, and something that kind of came back a little bit in the imagery is the doomsday costume of the Black Death bird mask. Have you guys seen it before?
Of course, yeah.
It was a 17th century French medical doctor, Charles Delorme, who designed this bird-like mask with a protruding beak. To this day, you can Google it, anybody who hasn't seen it. It's in our collective imagination as something synonymous with terror and with dread. The garment was initially modeled after the armored look of soldiers. That was his inspiration. So these doctors would have these long hanging waxen coats and round glass spectacles affixed to a bird mask. And it was supposed to shield doctors from contracting bubonic plague when they went to administer, medicine to people. Interestingly, the curved beak, a lot of people don't know, was filled with scented herbs and spices and dried flowers because there was this thing called miasma theory back then. Great concept, totally not scientific, but terrific concept of the times. which it preceded later germ theory, which was the idea that smells like rotting garbage or infected flesh could transmit a fatal substance, could kill you, in essence. So that's why he packed it with all these sort of incenses and things like that. But you have to ask yourself, sort of, you imagine these figures, and they always ministered to the sick at night. So they would go through these streets, they would go to these sanitariums and these quarantine sections, and you just imagine people, the elderly, the children, whose last visual image before their death was of a being that was clad in leather boots, gloves, and an overcoat, and they always carried a wooden stick to fend off the clutching hands of the sick as they were dying, just so you know, and the face of bird-like features. So it's interesting, in our states of emergency, we come to resemble those pagan gods. We create outfits and apparels that mirror something like what you would see in the hieroglyphs on an ancient Egyptian wall, sort of. So these hybrids, weirdly sort of mutated figures. So that's an invention of necessity, or supposedly what was thought of as necessity, in a state of despair. So I do think if we are getting close to the edge of the human experience, and who knows where we are, people like to throw around, we're in late this or we're in early that, I'm not quite sure where we are. But if we are close to the edge, we're going to start seeing that we're going to increasingly look like those assemblages of the ancient gods. And maybe even our fusion, not to get too technological here, but our futuristic fusion with artificial intelligence and with the machine is kind of the new prototype of those ancient gods that had a jackal's head and a human's body, or the centaurs, these sort of split figures. One other just last thing I wanted to say to that then is that there are also techniques that come from. One of the things that separates the monotheistic God from the pagan gods is that pagan gods, like X-Men, who are kind of pantheistic, tend to have just one power or a few powers. They're not total omniscient, omnipotent beings. They have highly specific powers, often that are linked to, as you know, highly specific concepts. So they're gods of this, gods of war, gods of love, gods of whatever. And then they have these things that go with them, alongside them. And there are two figures that then I mentioned in Omnicide II, that just to mention them quickly. There's a woman who is infamous in the history of the Islamic world. Her name was Hind bint Utbah, 17th century aristocratic woman. Her father, son, uncle, and brother were all killed in battle by the rising Islamic forces, so by the Prophet's forces, Prophet Muhammad's forces. And afterwards, she swore revenge, and she famously used to oppose the Muslim armies through acts of graphic degradation. So Hind was legendary. She would take legions of women into the hills surrounding the battlefields. And every time the Islamic armies would fight, she would hound, jeer, dance. She would throw stones at the incoming warriors. But there are fabulous stories of the fact that if you have ever heard of what's called the kel in Arabic, that la 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 sound, that's actually Hind's sound that was used against Islamic armies, but which the Prophet found so fierce and so powerful that he adopted it. He appropriated it from his enemy, interestingly, which is used to this day in weddings, but also in battle. An interesting thing with her, though, not just her ululation and shrieking at the top of her lungs, she used to mutilate the fallen bodies of Muslim warriors. So she used to carve ears and noses into necklaces and anklets. And she even was fond of cooking livers and ripe hearts right in front of the Prophet, in his view of his fallen warriors, and ingest them in front of him. She would eat them sort of there. So, and actually, he's so in awe of her that he actually, according to the legends, he requests an audience with her, brings her before his tent, and invites her to become part of the community, which she later does. But at that time, she refuses him, and one of his generals desires to kill her for her impudence or for her insolence, and instead the Prophet smiles and says, "Let her go," because she's very strong, in her abilities. Those types of actions, which are very graphic, physiological gestures, are things that you usually only read about in pagan mythologies. Sedna, the goddess of the Inuit peoples, supposedly ate the arm of her father and ate, I think, the organs of her mother. These are things that you typically don't read about. But one of the last ones I just want to say is there's another great heroine of the Middle East, of Arabia, a woman named Zarqa al-Yamama, and she supposedly had one supernatural power. She could see enemy armies coming from a distance. So she had this almost cyclopean foresight of being able to see 20 miles ahead and to know when there were enemy tribes about to raid or attack. And the other tribes figure this out eventually, that she just has this ability. And so one of the tribes decides to attack while cloaking themselves in trees. So they disguise themselves as trees, and they move, and then they stop, and they move. And she reports this vision to her tribal chief, her elders, and tells them that I see trees coming towards us. And they think she's become possessed and gone mad, so they don't listen to her. A little bit of what is called the Cassandra complex, on the Greek side, someone who can foretell but who's cursed to have no one believe them. So this is what happens to her. It's a great sort of paradox. And when the enemy tribe raids and takes over and conquers her tribal camp, they cut out her eyes. Except that the trick in the story is that she lied all the time. It wasn't her eyes that were the source of. She never saw things. She heard them coming. It was actually her ears. She had a kind of acoustic or auditory paranormal ability, supposedly. That was the true source of her intuition. And so I like these stories because, again, they distill or they isolate that pagan belief that you don't need to be omniscient or omnipotent. You just need to have one amazing technique, one singular, unprecedented, unforeseen technique, and that is your gateway into the future, into the unknown, towards a certain destiny. By the way, it's also, again, the logic of martial arts. Great kung fu masters, they're not masters of kung fu. They're masters of a single technique or of a school, and that is sufficient for them. That's an entire fate in and of itself. And so every one of these Omnicide passages are the attempt to unlock one of those powers that a certain type of mania provides. But it has the humility of not saying this is going to make you the Superman of existence or the great ruler of all things, but simply it gives you an angle, it gives you a vantage, it gives you a stronghold. And sometimes we know this from guerrilla warfare, asymmetrical, irregular warfare. Sometimes all you need is one subterranean passage or one single stronghold or corner to have a headquarters, to launch resistance against all things.
I think a lot about, since we talked about when you came on Zero and we talked about night, I still think a lot about this idea of darkness itself inviting and inciting over speculation, and how within what appears to be constraint, oftentimes we find expansive ways of seeing. You talk about in the end of Omnicide Volume 2, something I thought was very powerful, the 99 supposed names for God in the Islamic tradition. And as itself this sort of this embedded lie within this embedded trick within a larger framework, that in on the one hand you encounter sort of the bottleneck of meaning and experience, and the closer you get to a multi-faced doomsday composer magician figure, the closer you get to the Islamic God, the closer you get to these extracted qualifications of God and God's angels, the names of God. You mentioned St. Francis as in a canonizing act of expanding the communalization of the Acts of Apostles to animals and to the plagued, and remaining in this encounter. What it reminded me of the most is there's a German expressionist film called Algol that I'm very fond of. It's about basically a god from behind the star system of Algol visits a German miner and gives him a schematic for a machine that generates an infinite amount of energy. Not only out of darkness does all of this light, it goes awry, and it's too long of a movie. There's a big romance thing in it that doesn't need to be there. But more than anything, what it made me think of is that you have light coming out of this sort of fundamental darkness of human experience, mining, something I think about a lot. And then also you have the figure of Algol itself. And we know that Algol is not one star, but actually a system of stars that obscure themselves and bring themselves into a more clear resonance by sort of in their fundamental construction, the way they sit in the sky based off of our position, are they themselves their own form of trickery? And I just thought that was really powerful in this sort of limit exploration project that you've done over this and over your other works, and that just like that hit me like a ton of bricks when you were just talking a minute ago.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I would love to see that film. If you could send me that, the link to it or the name of it, I'll track it down. And always looking for fascinating things. And I know you guys have your own archives of things. So thank you for sharing them. When we mentioned the 99 names of God, I stumbled upon this other piece of information, which is that supposedly all the angels of God were made from sunlight in the Islamic tradition. But the devil, Satan, is the only one who's made from moonlight. I think that's a fascinating kind of detail. And it's not that it's made of something foreign to the good. Moonlight is also God's, an element of God. But it's a far more obscure and exclusive one than the daylight or sunlight that he disposes on all the angels, sort of, right? But it also, this is interesting that even at a astronomical level, if we take gods out of it, there is this phenomenon in a planetary phenomenon called dayside and nightside environments on planets. We have it too to some extent, but it's far more volatile and violent on other planets. So, for instance, scientists, they just recently confirmed the existence of an exoplanet that's called WASP-76b. And I mentioned this in Omnicide II. It has a close orbit to its parent star. And so that results in the continual pouring of iron rain, which is amazing. You can imagine a cosmos where iron is falling like rain. And that it has to do with all kinds of science that I don't claim to understand, tidal locking, but it has to do with showing only a partial face to the host star. So in the dayside hemisphere, it's roasting at 2,400 degrees Celsius, while the nightside hemisphere is subject to temperatures that are so cold that it allows condensation of these vaporized metals in the atmosphere and inducing iron rainstorms. So to some extent, then I see that as what we're playing at here, dayside and nightside environments, and so that's why the instances of ecstasy in the text, one of the things that could give a sort of vertigo or disequilibrium to some readers sometimes is they can't tell if I love or fear these manic and omnicidal pathways, and it's both. Because that's, if anything, it's a cool paradoxical fusion. It's the love of the fear of these things, right? That is there, and that fear is the fear not just of the fear of destruction, but the fear of their immensity. Like when we say, "I didn't know my own strength," the fear of their possibility, their potentiality, their transformative effects upon us, right? But I always think that if one should bet on the unknown. That's always, if there is some chase around the corner, some dark alley, go down it, sort of just to see what lies there. You can always retrace your steps and find your way back to the 0 degree. And this everyday reality that we're encapsulated, it'll always be there to welcome us back, and bring us back. We can always return. So yes, to test these things, but really then it's trying to figure out if we think of ideas almost like these planetary dayside and nightside environments, trying to figure out at what hour, at what particular split second, at what midnight juncture it turns to its night side, where the iron rain starts to fall. For me, that's catching it at that moment of the twist. It takes a certain sensitivity and a radar, and all of you have it as well. So it's fun to talk to you. Thank you for this so much, for the hospitality, but more than that, for keeping company in this work with me, as allies. That's the greatest form of intimacy. So thank you for that.
Yeah, Jason, just want to say thanks. A line that's going to stay with me from this text is that entire domains of knowing are necessarily forfeited, thrown from the towers, leaving only the mad forest of contemplation. as we enter upon the terrain of Omnicide. And just as a brief advertisement for our podcast, we're Acid Horizon, and I recently put out a tarot deck that has the Western tradition being thrown from the towers by an instance of deconstruction. So there was a synergy there. I was glad to see that our imagination had a nice confluence. So thanks again, and we hope to have you back on either Acid Horizon or Zero Books.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to all of you.